Evolution of military strategy and operational concepts in India. Let me attempt a contextual scan of how military strategy and operational concepts have evolved in India since independence, with a focus on attrition or manoeuvre as was practiced. Unlike other European continental armies like those of Germany, France, and Russia, who had recognized the importance of operational art, that is the intermediary level of warfare between strategy and tactics, the British Army continued to focus only on strategy and tactics. The entire post-independence generation of Indian military leaders, therefore, grew up with a void in operational art and an excellence in tactics, with a focus on defense and attrition warfare rather than offensive maneuver. During World War II, the British, including the British Indian Army, were the least enthusiastic to start with about maneuver warfare and greatly suffered losses in Europe, North Africa, and even Southeast Asia in the initial phases of World War II. No surprise that during my staff college days at Kimberley, UK in 1985, we were taught mainly the maneuver warfare exploits of the Americans, the Germans, and even the Russians. And only general from the British Army who found a place amongst those luminaries was Bill Slim of the 14th Army Burma fame. This is the army we inherited in 1947, mainly rooted in the tactical, though it must be admitted that the J&K Ops of 1947-48 did show operational level brilliance and tactical doggedness. But this affair continued right up to 1962 Ops, which exposed the hollowness of the senior Indian military hierarchy. The IAF and Indian Navy were small services struggling to define their future expansion. And there is little evidence of thought having been given to operational level or maneuver warfare. As far as capability development and force structuring is concerned, the 1962 debacle was not only a shock, but also a wake-up call for both the political and military hierarchies, leading to a renewed focus on defense, especially against China. The mountain divisions were raised against China, though not with the full equipment that was envisaged. And pragmatism started reflecting in our doctrine as well as military strategy. On the Western Front against Pakistan as well, some equipment was inducted and one corps was raised just before the 1965 operations. But to call these changes transformational would be stretching it a bit far. India's major offensive in 1965 in the Sialkot sector was tactically rooted, where the Indian Armored Corps excelled, but lacked the operational design to achieve their objectives. But it's not fair to pass judgment with hindsight, since the Indian Army of 65 lacked the tools or the ethos or even training to pursue operational art and maneuver warfare. 1965 was at best a stalemate which jolted us further. The 1971 war, apart from the spectacular victory against East Pakistan, was also a sort of redemption after 1962 and 1965. The credit for this must go to the strategic leadership at the top, both political and military. The period of 1965 to 1971 saw the induction of Russian equipment in significant numbers in the Army and the Indian Air Force. There was also a slight shift in doctrine from defensive to offensive, and this reflected mainly in the operations against East Pakistan. The ops in the East were a very remarkable exhibit of maneuver warfare and operational art in a most challenging environment. Operational leaders like Sagat Singh were bold and reflected the essence of maneuver warfare. General Sagat Singh, then commanding 4 Corps, when his advance was stopped on the banks of the Meghna River because the only bridge had been blown up, he decided to take a risk and put a whole brigade across the mighty Meghna River using the meager helicopter resources available to him. 2 reasons can be ascribed to this transformation in the approach of the Indian Army: a good preparation time and overwhelming confidence. The mood itself was offensive. On the Western Front, however, we at best practiced offensive defense, as also confirmed by Lieutenant General K.K. Singh, who was commanding 1 Corps on the Western Front in the Shakargarh Bulge. When I was the commanding general of Strike 1, as 1 Corps had been rechristened and renamed, I met General K.K. Singh at his house in December 2010. In that conversation, when I asked him as to what was actually the aim of 1 Corps operations and why didn't we achieve our operational objectives, General KK was frank and said that I was aware that the focus of the Indian onslaught was in the East, and therefore I was conscious that I should not incur unnecessary casualties. He said, I was also conscious that 1 Corps had both the defensive and offensive responsibilities, which weighed on my mind. Going further ahead after 71, I can affirm that General Sundarji, General Krishna Swami Sundarji, who was Chief of the Army Staff in the late 80s, must get major credit for redefining our doctrine and introducing deep and fast maneuvers, made possible by the induction of matching equipment like T-72 tanks, which my regiment, 7th Cavalry, was the first to get, and accompanying BMP-1 and 2 infantry carriers, supported by mine-breaching and bridging equipment. I was fortunate to have gone through most of the exercises where our skills were honed in maneuver warfare, starting with exercise Shikar in 31 Armored Div, when I was the adjutant of my regiment, and which was the first time that we practiced deep maneuvers with the T-72 tanks, and later exercise Digvijay in 1982, when I had moved out to 2 Corps on staff. Another name that stands out is that of Lieutenant General Hanuj Singh, who as GOC 2 Corps laid great emphasis on maneuver warfare, though his approach was steady and cautious compared to Sundarji's flamboyance. In my view, maneuver warfare is a mix of both approaches. Let me recount an encounter that I had with General Hanuj, known as the soldier saint of the Indian Army, after he had retired to his hermitage in the suburbs of Dehradun, where he was in deep prayers and meditation. As Southern Army Commander, I had to visit IMA for a talk to the gentlemen cadets, and I told the commandant that could he seek a time with General Hanuj for me to meet him. He said, sir, he's become a recluse and doesn't like disturbance. I said, all the same, please put in a request with a mention that I'm from the cavalry and have commanded 1 Corps. Promptly, I got affirmation of a meeting, and on the appointed day, I reached his hut where he was meditating. He soon joined me and we got chatting. I could see that he was very, very keen to know what was happening in the Indian Army, and especially what were our concepts and philosophies as compared to 1971, when he had led the famous Pune Horse in the Battle of Basantha. So in the absence of maps, I took out a A4 plain sheet of paper on which we drew the boundary from Pathankot in Punjab and up to Jammu. And then General Hanout and I had a great discussion of the 1971 war and how we would do or how we could approach this problem if it arose again. We promised to meet again using better maps, and I could make out that he was really keen. Unfortunately, he passed away a few years later, and this could not be accomplished. After being exposed to both the Russian and the NATO concepts at Tank Academy in Moscow and the Staff College in Kimberley, I was blessed to have participated in all major maneuvers that were undertaken by the Indian Army, including Operation Parakram. But before I go to my assessment and analysis, let me just cover my thought process and what I picked up from my training in both Russia and NATO. The Tank Troops Command and Staff course in Moscow was attended by me at a very young service of 6 years. 70% of this course was devoted to tactics and operational art and 30% to technology. We started with learning the employment of motor rifle regiments, equivalent to brigades, graduated to the divisional level and finished at the army level. The teaching largely drew from their experience in World War II, refined towards facing the NATO as in the 80s. Their employment of large forces, mainly armor and other mechanized forces, was more a science than an art. The acme lay in build-up and launch through the designated area at the precise time, either as part of the first echelon or the follow-up second echelon or shock armies, or as part of the OMG, the operational maneuver groups. The overall philosophy was vetted in massive fire preparation of the battlefield, both by artillery and air, and relentless momentum thereafter. Objectives had to be achieved, casualties notwithstanding, and where a particular formation reached its culminating point, the follow-on forces would assimilate them and continue the advance. Once the enemy's defense was breached, stress was for mechanized forces to attack from the line of march. Non-linearity of the battlefield was maintained by dropping Spetsnaz, their special forces, way back in depth, as also the operational maneuvers groups, which will force their way through the first and second echelon battlefield and hit for targets in depth. Overall, the stress was on massed employment of armor as part of an all-arms application on the battlefield. The training levels of a largely conscript army also influenced the employment. At Kimberley Staff College, which one was privileged to attend, having topped the Staff College exam in India, I got to see the Western side or the NATO philosophy, dealing mainly at the level of armored brigades and armored division as part of the British Army of the Rhine. The employment philosophy was largely based on offensive defense, stemming the tide, drawing the Russian forces to pre-designated areas in depth where counterstrokes would cause disarray and sufficient destruction to buy time for reserves to come into action. NATO faced the dilemma on how to tackle the follow-on forces and the operational maneuver groups, which were following in a relentless momentum, one after the other. They relied a lot on initiative and ingenuity of their battle leaders, partly through directive style of command. Their employment of armor was still evolving, and despite the great disparity in force levels, they were inclined to still employ their armor piecemeal an old British tradition, though this was beginning to be challenged by the new breed of army leaders. Luckily for me, my senior directing staff at that time, Colonel Walter, later Major General Walter Courage, was also a proponent of the new thinking, and one was given key appointments in most of their training exercises. Left unsaid in most of these exercises was the employment of tactical nuclear weapons when the situation went beyond control. Both sides, especially the Russians, were prepared to fight through a contaminated battle space. Overall, I would endorse the largely held view that if war had broken out, the Russians would have broken through the NATO defenses in depth in a matter of 3 to 4 days, though at considerable cost, and thereafter the nuclear dimension would have come into play. Now, a bit of analysis of what I have said till now. We have developed expertise in set piece battles, including offensives. But our DNA has not imbibed the true philosophy of maneuver warfare, directive style of command, and even operational art. There have been exceptions, mainly confined to the mechanized forces and some others, but these are few and far between. Most of our exercises become rehearsals, and therefore one is not sure how the hierarchy would react when faced with changing situations and surprises thrown up on the battlefield. Long exposures in CI and the no loss of territory on the line of control and line of actual control also detract from pursuing maneuver warfare and directive style of command, though it remains even more relevant in these environments. The initial freeze in recent standoff with China in Ladakh is a case in point. The mobilization for Operation Parakram was tardy, mainly because the Union War Book was not imposed. I was Director MO5 and quite in the thick of things. There was seriousness about teaching Pak a lesson, but as emerged later, the government had not taken any final decision. Towards the end of December 2001, I was moved without relief to take over an armored brigade in the desert, which was to convert under those conditions to T-90 tanks. To the best of my knowledge, the operational plans during Op Parakram envisaged deep strikes, especially in the desert sector. Variations may have been discussed, but there was no change to the main plans based on maneuver warfare and operational art, a sort of blitzkrieg to pulverize the Pakistanis. Many proposed D-days came and went, but with hindsight, one can say confidently, at least in the desert sector, success would have been ours at least cost. Let me recount a meeting I had with the late Shri Jaswant Singh ji, who was at that time the finance minister and had also tenanted the appointments of foreign minister and defense minister at some time. I met him when he was visiting India over a dinner at that institution. And after initial introductions, I asked him, I said, sir, can you tell me what was the political objective of mobilizing the army for Op Parakram? And he looked at me and said, half jokingly, that I am also trying to discover the same till date. But actually what he told me suggested that when the attack on Parliament took place, the government took a decision that the Indian army will be mobilized for war. What actual option would be chosen would be decided at an appropriate stage. However, as we are all aware, after President Musharraf, in his famous talk in early January, conceded that he will not allow Pakistani territory to be used against India, and the intervention of superpowers, especially the United States, the operation did not go through. A number of factors in post-Op Parakram analysis led to the introduction of the cold start doctrine, which in military terminology is also known as snipe, short notice, intense, proactive, escalatory continuum. Delay in mobilizing the strike corps from the hinterland over 50-60 stations. Whilst ops could start across the line of control, the pivot corps had to wait for the arrival of the strike corps. A firm realization that next time India had to take the initiative and launch offensives soonest before and therefore deny windows to leading powers to intervene. Having a range of operations from shallow to deep offensives which could be built upon as the war progressed. The nuclear backdrop also had a bearing. The cold start concept seeks to leverage India's conventional superiority against Pakistan in a series of swift, limited strikes initiated by the pivot corps and parts of strike corps, which could be gradually developed into deeper penetrations as necessitated. The doctrine, though discussed and practiced, was, to the best of my knowledge, never formally promulgated. It was an innovative thought based on manoeuvre warfare, and the credit for this should go to then Chief General N.C. Vij and Western Army Commander General Shamsher Mehta and their team over a large amount of deliberations, which one also happened to be part of. This doctrine did move the thinking of the Indian Army towards manoeuvre warfare, but whether it has taken roots remains doubtful. The main pitfall of the cold start was that it was predicated on the government giving the go-ahead for launching an offensive at very short notice after a major incident had occurred. Though Pak has tried to counter this with their RRR defensive concept, it still remains relevant with imaginative variations, as would the deep strike strategy. Having looked at this, let me come to the present with a policy of aggressive retort. Under the mistaken notion of its nuclear umbrella preventing India's conventional response, Pakistan has continued with its misadventures and proxy war against India, especially in Jammu and Kashmir. Finally, India's patience ran out after the terrorist strike at Army camp at Uri on 18 September and the suicide bombing against a CRPF convoy at Pulwama on 14 February 2019. What followed was a surgical strike by the Indian Special Forces across the line of control in 2016, and after Pulwama, a deep airstrike against Pakistan at Balakot on 26 February 2019, and a new normal of aggressive retort firmly established. Let me now shortly cover the post-Cold War, where a new paradigm has appeared in military affairs. The emergence of non-state actors as a major force in the battleground, especially in Middle East, Asia, and Africa. Hybrid warfare, and finally, beyond the traditional, emerging battle domains. To start with, let us talk of the emergence of non-state actors. The perceived traditional characteristics of modern warfare received a jolt with the emerging presence of non-state actors. This was best exemplified by the proliferation of terrorism and suicide bombings. A return to the forms of war, which nationalization of warfare had brought to an end in the 16th and 17th centuries and replaced by a disciplined military organization, can already be observed. Civilian targets are now more and more taking the place of military objectives, starting with towns and villages overrun and despoiled by militias and warlords, and extending to the symbols of political and economic might that were targeted in the US by terrorists on 9/11, 2001. Suicide bombers compensate for their military inferiority by giving up any chance of survival. A new perverse form of heroism has developed, which post-heroic societies are ill-prepared to deal with from a military or psychological point of view. Technology has given lethality to small groups of people, especially with the advent of the suicide bomber and IEDs, improvised explosive devices. But these groups, though seemingly tactically lethal, still risk losing support of the people due to their indiscriminate application of lethal force. Ironically, their tactical success carries within it the seeds of strategic failure. Non-state actors and terrorists are unlikely to achieve the power to destroy the developed nations, but will continue to cause anxiety, selective harm, and sometimes immense psychological collateral damage. A word about hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare is a military strategy that blends conventional, irregular, and cyber warfare. This approach to conflicts is a potent and complex variation of warfare. It can also be used to describe the flexible and complex dynamics of the battle space, requiring a highly adaptable and resilient response. There is every likelihood that hybrid threat actors will increase the frequency and diversity of ways and means in the pursuit of their interests. As such, the hybrid construct presents numerous implications for visualizing the future operational environment and how militaries should formulate strategies and resources investment priorities in the future. Finally, a word about emerging battle domains and battle spaces. War and conflict have been and will remain intrinsic to the human DNA. Only the form and instruments will continue to change with an ever-increasing rapidity. Post the Cold War, there has been a paradigm shift in the very character of conflict. Modern-day conflicts are not merely confined to states, but have expanded to include subnationalities, non-state actors, terrorists, religious fanatics, and ethnic interests. The battle space has expanded to include space and cyber domains, in addition to the traditional three-dimensional air, land, and sea domains. The manifestations would encompass non-kinetic confrontation, as seen in Ladakh recently, non-contact warfare, contract warfare, and traditional armed conflict in its hybrid avatar under an informational gaze. Technology is influencing the multi-domain battle space like never before. The fourth industrial revolution is characterized more by fusion of technologies, that is, blurring the line between physical, digital, and biological spheres. Applications involving artificial intelligence, quantum computing, machine learning, nanotechnology, and genetic engineering riding on communication highways have very distinctly impacted the character of 21st century warfare. To summarize my episode, let me cover a few aspects of concern and import to us. The Indian Armed Forces have a job to perform, which is both universal as well as contextual to the environment they operate in. Against the former, especially with reference to their effectiveness, their training, and above all, the quality of leadership, the standards to judge the Indian military should and would compare to the best in the world. In matters which are contextual, like their place in the security calculus, defense budgets, technology adoption, and defense equipment indigenization, they may be judged on different parameters. In the absence of an officially articulated national security strategy, the armed forces have based their capability development on the likely threat envisaged on either flanks, as also catering to limited out-of-area contingencies, including UN peacekeeping operations. Certain strategies / capabilities also resulted from events / standoffs to the proxy war by Pakistan in J&K in the 90s, which resulted in the birth of the Rashtriya Rifles, in hindsight, which proved its worth, thus isolating the mainline army from getting sucked into these counterinsurgency operations. Similarly, Parakram gave birth to the doctrine of Cold War, which proved its worth and put intense pressure on Pakistan. It is not as though there is a total void in communication / guidance from the government. The Raksha Mantri's operational directive, which is updated every 5 years, provides specific guidance as to what is expected of the armed forces of the Union in the military domain, though it is not as overarching as a NSS would be. I am sanguine that we will see the arrival of the national security strategy sooner than later. Lessons from recent conflicts in Syria and Armenia have brought the focus on PGMs and drones, which did inflict a large number of casualties on all arms, including mechanized forces. But any obituary of mechanized forces is not only premature, but based on lessons drawn from contestants not particularly adept in maneuver warfare. On the subcontinent, mechanized forces will continue to remain relevant against both adversaries in an all-arms grouping, as seen in Ladakh recently. Of course, both defensive and offensive measures to cater to emerging threats, including drones / swarm bots, I'm sure are being put in place using both technology and tactics. India faces a very challenging threat scenario with its two neighbors, Pakistan and China, who are also in strategic cahoots, posing a two-front dilemma for India. It has been widely accepted that whilst Pakistan is the short-term irritant, China is the major long-term threat. Whilst at the surface, and perhaps as a mindset, the nation and our armed forces have found strategic comfort in being focused on Pakistan, Doklam triggered a reality check for security analysts, which was further reinforced by the happenings in eastern Ladakh recently. Thus, two major strategic shifts are happening in our higher defense mindsets, from a Pak-centric to a China-centric orientation, and from sub-conventional to conventional preparedness. The Indian Army has enough boots on ground to match the Chinese. Since our operational strategy will largely be deterrence and offensive defense oriented, the Mountain Strike Corps is very much conceived as a part of this strategy and should now be maturing in the form of IBGs or integrated battle groups. A military force development strategy to contain China will require a certain amount of capabilities for the future. They are likely to engage, the Chinese are likely to engage in a war minimizing close physical contact and rely on long-range missiles, drones, swarms, accompanied by cyber attacks. EW to degrade our networks and aim to achieve information dominance. India's capability development, therefore, should cater to such a war that may be forced on us. India has been a late starter as far as cyber warfare capabilities are concerned. But in recent times, a focused effort has been seen both at the national level as also within the armed forces. In conclusion, I would like to just reiterate and emphatically state that military futures is entirely imaginable. For this to happen, there's an urgent need for change in the strategic and operational mindset so as to be able to adapt to the changing conceptual, structural, and cultural military needs and sensibilities, as also adjusting to the skill and speed at which the transition is being made. I am certain that the Indian Armed Forces are up to the challenge of the threats and challenges that will be thrown at them in the future. Dhanyavad. Thank you. Jai Hind.